Fantastic. So let's get into it. So SWOOP Analytics, we are in the business of collaboration, of course, and most recently we've really been deep diving into adoption on M365. So of course this is kind of the perfect forum for us to talk about what we've found out so far. And I think it was probably around July last year, Dr. Laurence, who's here on the call today, he wrote an article about the 7 deadly sins of collaboration, and that's really sort of formed the basis for one of our brand new products, SWOOP for M365, which we'll have the opportunity to deep dive into today. So my name's Emily. I look after customer success at SWOOP Analytics for all of our APAC customers. I'm also joined by Dr. Laurence Lockley, who is one of our co-founders and our chief data scientist, who's going to introduce what these 7 deadly sins are and the collaboration habits. And I'm also joined by Cai Kjaer, who is our CEO and co-founder, so to sort of help get a bit of discussion going. So if you have any questions or comments, or as we sort of reflect today in your current M365 adoption habits, please use the chat throughout, or even potentially come off mute if you'd like to contribute to the conversation as well. But before we get into that, I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this online session is being hosted. And for myself, I'm participating from the Central Coast of New South Wales. So I would like to acknowledge the Darkinjung people and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where all of our participants are located. Also to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on today's session. So to get into things and to reveal the 7 collaboration habits and sort of deep dive into that, I'll hand over to Laurie to walk through. So over to you, Laurie.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Yeah, well, the genesis of this, our product, I guess, was probably when we published our Teams benchmarking report in last year, and some of our customers came back and said, oh, you guys are so deep into Teams, channels and Yammer and so forth, but we have to deal with the whole M365, can't you sort of cover things like email and SharePoint and what have you? And, after taking a breath, we thought, well, there is a lot of data in the Microsoft admin reports, and we already draw some of that data into our Teams product. So, I guess we probably could look at that, but we didn't want to just do the same activity reports and just redisplay what the admins see to everybody else. We wanted to swoopify it a bit. And over the many years that we've worked with our partners and our customers, we got to know what sort of good looked like in terms of digital behaviours, as well as having numbers that we could put against that. So putting that together, I came up with this blog post that we call the 7 deadly sins. And these are the 7 deadly sins, except that we've changed the names to become more positive habits. So if you read the paper, you will see the sins are things like living in email, living in chat, being in meetings too much, not using Yammer, all this sort of stuff, not having your camera on and so forth. But, we've actually sort of changed the naming of these to be more positive, we were told, because people don't react to criticism, they actually react to progress. So you'll see names like Chat Liberated and Email Liberated, the Asynchronous Collaborator, the Community Contributor, which is really the Yammer and Teams sort of balance. And you'll see things like, I liked Camera Confidence, because we people not turning the camera on, we thought that was a bad habit, but, we couldn't say, well, that's bad. So the term Camera Confidence came up and Email Liberated came up. So much more positive and encouraging terminology. But the other important point is that we didn't want to say that, you shouldn't use email, you shouldn't use chat, you shouldn't be turn your camera off, because there are times that you should have your camera off, and there are times that you do need to use email and so forth. So the way we designed the habits was really as a form of a balance. What should you, if you're going to use less email, what should you use instead? If you're going to chat less, what are you going to use instead, and so forth? If you're not going to meet as much, what are you going to use instead? And of course, we feel that, certainly in the asynchronous world, where we think the channels are very important, and Yammer is also important in terms of working asynchronously, we need to look at that balance, and get that balance right. Now, at SWOOP, we believe we know what good looks like, because we measure everything that you do, and then we rank what you do, and we can work out what the top 20% are doing. And typically, we will set the bar at about the top 20%. And the reason we do this is because then we know that the goals are achievable. People are doing them. In fact, the top 20% of the population are actually doing these things. So we can sort of say, well, if you're sort of working at this sort of level, then you are sort of working at the right sort of level. So we can be very specific about what the right level, analytic level is. So we've got these 7 habits, and you can read about the sins that sit underneath those habits somewhere else. And of course, Emily will be showing you, sort of what the actual tool looks like in working to these habits. So let's move on, Emily, to your slide. I think it is our little quiz.
Yes. So to get everyone a bit energized, we'll if you'd like to use the QR code on the screen to access a few quick quiz questions. Alternatively, you can use the link there, just www.menti.com, and then there's a code there. So I'll just give everyone a moment to get that loaded up. And the purpose of this quiz is to get you to start thinking about what your perception of what good looks like on M365, but more specifically around how much you are relying on email. So I'm going to just switch over screens now so that we can start to see if we've got some results coming in. It should all be starting to load up now, and I can see that there are some votes popping up, which is great. That's what we want to see. So it seems as though we have most people sort of opting for the lower options around having 2 emails for every post you're putting on Yammer or in a channel, 5 emails. For other people, that might look slightly different, of course. There are a few options coming in there for if you're sending 30 emails and even 125 emails sent. That sounds like some really intense email happening there. So when we look at some of the benchmarks and looking at that sort of top 20% bracket that Laurie just referred to, we find that, and how it's reflected in our tool as well, which you'll see in just a moment, is that best practice and what you should really aim for is for the 5 emails sent, you post 1 Yammer or channel message. So it's great to see that people are sort of putting in those responses on the lower end of the spectrum. That's definitely what we'd like to see. But from here, I also want you to consider what bad or not so good looks like as well. So if I just move through to the next question, which should pop up on your device or wherever you're answering the questions, what do you think bad looks like for that email liberated habit in terms of the balance between the email and the channel and Yammer collaboration? I guess for any of the options that you see here, I don't think you can really go wrong. Like, this is all sort of started getting up into the higher numbers. And it's actually quite interesting when you look at this reflected for real data for real organizations. And I think we'll even get the opportunity to look at that for an anonymous organization today, just to show you that really stark difference where you are getting it right and where it can be, maybe there's a little way to go with that sort of overall adoption journey and understanding what tool when, which is really the challenge that we're looking to overcome with SWOOP for M365, the product. So now we've sort of kind of got the current state of play and what we're all thinking. I'm going to stop the sharing on that one and head back into our slides, if you just bear with me for one moment. And what we're going to do now is have a look at sort of the why, the how, and the what good looks like behind the email liberated habit. So the interesting thing about email, and we can also, I'm sure this would resonate with most people on this call today, is that we all have our own specific email habit that we sort of like to stick to. So for some of us, it might be that you feel like you need to clear your inbox at the end of the day. For some of you, you might have specific points throughout the day where you go in and check in. But we do get asked quite a lot when we look at these habits, well, why do we need to move out of email? What's the reasoning behind it, and why should we be collaborating more in channels or on Yammer or in chat potentially? And I think one of the main things that come up is really that kind of interruption effect and what that can look like. So if you look at some of the data and research behind this, what we've sort of see is that the average worker is interrupted potentially every 10 minutes or on average up to 56 times per day by email. And it can take around 25 minutes to completely refocus that attention back onto your original task. And if you sort of add up what that might look like across a day, that's potentially 2 hours spent recovering from those distractions. So, email is really one of those big interrupters. And when you look at that sort of combined with, the nightmare of sort of file sharing and sharing those different versions in email, we've all seen the V1, V2, final, V3 draft, and it's just an absolute nightmare if you're just relying on email for that sharing. But for us to sort of reconsider and maybe think about the ways that we could shift that behavior a little bit more, we would suggest moving more of those internal conversations into the Teams channels or potentially into Yammer as well. And if I think about the way that comes to life for SWOOP and working within SWOOP Analytics, one of the first things that I was told when I was onboarded to the company was that we do not send email internally. That is sort of the cardinal rule for us here at SWOOP, and it doesn't happen. We always use channels, and we always use Yammer. But then for those sort of more quick, sort of tactical type conversations that sort of happen in the spur of the moment, I'm going to pick up the kids from school, or I won't be online for this meeting, or I'm 5 minutes late. Those sorts of things you can use chat for. And then for any of those kind of big, broader internal comms type conversations and sort of broadcast type messages, definitely sort of shifting away from those classic email distribution lists. And if you think about that from an example of maybe it's a leadership update or a leadership newsletter that's going out every single week, having those conversations on Yammer, definitely much more effective to have more of that two-way reciprocated conversation. I'm sure the only time you would ever see that reply all button clicked for a big email send out would be a complete accident. It just doesn't happen. So Yammer is the perfect place for those conversations. And then when we go to this sort of what good looks like and what the good balance is, which is what we just sort of looked at in the quiz that we spoke to, we would recommend for every 5 emails you send that there's 1 channel or Yammer message. And then for every 2, the lower end of the spectrum, or the poorer performance would be for every 200 emails you're sending 1 channel or Yammer message. So there's sort of that really big spectrum in between. And I would really like you to start thinking about what this might look like for yourself, or maybe it's for your team, or maybe it's for your broader organization. But we've also thought about email from this perspective and being email liberated from the perspective of sort of ROI and what that outcome is. So, Laurie, would you like to jump in and talk a little bit to ROI?
Let me talk to this. I mean, we're inspired, actually. Cai's just written a blog post on this, so you'll see this pretty shortly. But we're inspired by one of our customers in the US who was doing this thing around what's the ROI from being email liberated. Now, we can't mention the company, but he said he was a data nerd from Atlanta, and we're allowed to say that. So, but essentially, with this habit, we're looking to do less email and replace that with channel and Yammer messages. And so, what is the value of doing that? Now, when we actually, you can play the next part forward. When we actually look at the time that it takes to read and write an email versus a channel message or a Yammer message, it's about half. So we've got these timings from some of Microsoft's research and some of our own, but it's fairly solid. We've tested it across a number of different sources, if you like. So if you like, for every email, you're taking all the time that you might spend around an email. If you substitute that with a channel message or a Yammer message, you're basically saving half the time. Now, our benchmarking, we've just started. We're doing a big benchmark push right now, so you can still join this benchmarking for M365, but our most recent test set, we had 9 organisations with nearly 60,000 staff that were actually using email, right? So, and on average, we found that sort of people on average read about 30 emails a day, and they write about 6 emails a day. So they spend about 2 hours a day on email, and that sort of pretty much meshes with what we're seeing in other reports as well. Now, if we take a conservative view that 25% of that email could be substituted, and largely we're saying internal email. So if in your organisation, or if you look at your inbox or outbox or what have you, and find that about 25% of your emails are actually internal, then you can actually swap those emails for a channel or a Yammer message, if you like. And if you do that, you'll save about half of your time. on 25% of your email. If we crunch the numbers according to our friend in Atlanta, you know, the average time saving was about 11 minutes a day. Doesn't sound a lot, but when you work out the actual the costs, and they were using $80 an hour as a fully loaded cost, you know, for an organisation of 20,000, all of a sudden we're talking about $300,000 a day, or $77 million a year. You know, and if you want to think about those numbers in terms of staff, that's like hiring 500 more people, right? So, and that's just from converting, you know, sort of, you know, a few emails, you know, a quarter of your emails to channel messages. Not even talking about the added value and actually sharing it with people rather than having to send multiple emails to get the same effect. This is purely on time saving. So it's quite a conservative sort of measure. So the numbers are pretty big when you want to do that ROI calculation for this. So I'll leave that back. I'll hand back to Emily, and she hopefully can show you how we can help you in that space.
Thanks, Laurie. And I also wanted to see, and I know we're sort of just conscious of time as well, and I can see there's a bit of activity happening in the chat, but as I mentioned, we'd like you to really consider if you are, you know, do you think you are happily email liberated? Do you think if you looked at the data in SWOOP, which we'll look at in just a moment, do you think you'd be sitting at some of those higher scores? How do you think you compare to your colleagues? And if you think this is still a really big area of opportunity in your organisation, Cai, is there any sort of activity happening in the chat there that might be interesting to talk about?
I think there's sort of Megan was putting in a comment in about, I guess, about still living in email, but also doing a lot of work on in other channels. So I think my sense is that the audience we have here today, you guys are probably pretty advanced. Like all the people that I go to these sort of events. I mean, we all pretty good, but compared to our colleagues, sometimes it's really easy to lose sense of like how far behind our colleagues are. And as I put in the chat, there's just so much email happening. I mean, the data is irrefutable, and therefore sometimes we just got to go back to basics and really need to see, because the big problem is really that email bit. Like there's so many people that are still trapped in that, and we got to get them into a smarter and better way of using M365 to collaborate.
And I just saw a comment pop up, just a question from Victoria. So the act of going to email to read takes longer than the same contact in a channel or in Yammer. Do you want to talk to that a little bit, maybe Cai or Laurie?
Yeah.
Go on, Cai. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think that the sort of time it takes, obviously it's different for every individual. So some people spend a lot more time reading an email, some people just flick through it and so forth. So a lot of the research that we drew from was really taking an average of that. So that may not be you, but it is an average. And certainly for email, it's actually the average that Viva Insights uses. So we're fairly close with them. So we know we wanted to line up our numbers as similar as we could to theirs. So a lot of this is actually drawn from Microsoft's own sort of research as well, and what they apply in the Viva platform. So when you look at when you get your My Analytics thing and says that you're spending so much time in email, they're using the conversion factors of emails to time, the same that we're using. So in essence, we're in some ways we're relying on their research. For some areas like Yammer, for instance, they don't measure that, but we do. So we more or less did our own research, and we found that it was Yammer and channels were similar in terms of read-write time. So that's. And I
think people are also just Victoria. They just you're more verbose on email. It's like, oh, write an email. It's like, and you tend to make it a lot longer. Whereas they're just more. I mean, chat is probably the briefest, where you're almost, instead of saying okay, you just write K. So like that's ultra short. But even the channels are actually, channel messages and Yammer messages are shorter than emails. And then you because also you don't need to write all the context and introduce someone new into the thread, all that stuff you're doing on email, saying, I need to introduce you to blah, blah, blah. It just means that the messages get shorter and more concise in channels and on Yammer.
And I think some of the email read time includes search time as well. Like it does take you a while to find things sometimes on email compared to when you're sitting in a team channel and you know where they're coming from. And so you don't have to filter out all that other stuff that you've got running in as well. So in essence, as I said, they are averages. They might not be you, but in essence, we're just relying on the broader research to come up with those conversion factors.
Megan has also asked, how does this compare with organisations who don't use Yammer and just have teams to work out loud?
Well, we don't really differentiate. I mean, we put them in the same bucket because, as far as we can see, it takes the messages about the same length in Teams channels and on Yammer. So we don't really differentiate between the two.
Yeah. So if they don't use Yammer, the email liberated score won't be any different because they're still using. We group Yammer and Teams channels together in terms of how we measure their asynchronous behaviour. So,
but it's good actually, Emily, if you're able to show. There's a couple of examples that I just think, it's just when you see this with your own data or you see this for your company, you sort of go, man, we got to find a way of improving this, and the opportunities are huge. So, Emily, can you show us some of that?
Yeah, of course. So I'm just showing you, this is a real SWOOP for M365 dashboard to show you how it's reflected. So at the moment, this is actually looking at my own personal insights and the way that I'm using M365. So to sort of kind of go back to what this product is doing and what it's going to help you with, it's helping you to overcome that what tool when challenge, not only at sort of the enterprise level, which will give you those broader insights about, how these habits come to life across the entire organization, but also then being able to drill down and see how those habits are reflected for particular segments, whether that's, on a department level or if it's sort of job roles, but then also being able to surface all the way down to the individual level, which this is the personal dashboard that we're looking at right now. So if we as we've sort of introduced a lot of those, 7 deadly sins and the collaboration habits here, as I scroll down, you'll see how I'm served up specific scores for the way that I'm aligning with each of these habits. Across the board, I know I'm sharing this quite confidently because the scores do look relatively good, which is a good sign. But as we sort of drill down on that email liberated measure, for my own insights, having a relatively healthy score at 85, and I can see that my ratio is sitting at, 4 emails for every Teams channel or Yammer message. So in my role, I am constantly collaborating externally most of the time, so I do really rely on email. This isn't suggesting that I don't use email or that I shouldn't use email. It's just about balancing that out much more with the channel and collaboration, of course. But, this is a really great example of what good looks like for an organisation that's, remote first, digital first. We were born remote, of course. But if I sort of flick that switch and we look at some anonymous data from an organisation that we have sort of permission to share this, when you look at the email liberated measure here, you can see that, maybe there's some sort of learning or education program required, really on a lot of these measures. But if we deep dive into the email liberated, and if we think back to some of those quiz questions that we looked at earlier, for this organisation, on average, people are sending 176 emails for every Teams channel or Yammer message that's going out. So you can see there's this really wide spectrum of where you could potentially fall. So if you were sort of interested in seeing what this might look like in your organisation or on the personal level or for, a particular segment, I will, towards the end of the session, show you how you can get involved in a benchmarking study that we have coming up very shortly. And you can also trial this product for free as well to see what that would potentially look like. So very interesting to see that sort of difference between the what good looks like and the what not so good looks like. And from here, Kirsty, do you have a preference on, do we sort of just keep running through or?
Yeah. Feel free to keep running through those that, if you can't stay past the hour, that's okay. It is recorded for you to be able to come back. So I'm more than happy to go through. There was a bit in the updates today. Often it's sort of anywhere 15 to 20 minutes, but there was a lot going on. Plus it didn't help that I crashed.
Yes, of course. So those things always come up. So that's okay. Well, we might just quickly head in and have a look at what this sort of is reflected as for the asynchronous collaborator habit as well. So if you want to jump back into the quiz again, we can also have a look and think about what good looks like for asynchronous collaborators and what not so good looks like as well. So if you just jump onto your device again, it should be loading up again. So I will also then jump across into our results once again, if you give me one moment. Great, I can see that people have had access again. So our next question around what do you think good looks like for an asynchronous collaborator, and this is broken down by how much time you're spending in meetings versus how much you are using Yammer and channels to collaborate. So if you maybe even think about this from your own perspective and maybe where you would like to be sitting, or potentially from your organization's perspective, we're looking at this here as, we've got about, the majority is actually sitting for every 2 hours in team meetings that you're then posting one Yammer or channel message. What we've found through our sort of initial benchmarking and looking into this, we find that it's actually the top 20% are sort of performing around that for every 35 minutes in Teams meetings you're posting a message on Yammer or in channels. So it also feels like there's a little way to go there as well with the way that we're thinking about it on this call here today. And then we'll go to one final question as well. This is sort of, again, on looking at the other flip side of things. What do you think bad or not so good looks like, to put it a bit more politely, for the asynchronous collaborator habit? So these are sort of looking at much higher time periods as well. I guess for any of these, we would say that they look bad now that we've already uncovered what good looks like. So thank you to those who are sort of popping in those votes. And then I will just quickly get to as well just sort of the why and the how again for the asynchronous collaborator habit. And then we might just open it up for some extra questions and discussion as well. It's great to see that the chat is quite vibrant at the moment. So I'll just sort of switch back to my slides 1 second. So for the why, we know, and it's actually quite fitting that we're talking about this today, because I'm from my understanding, at least in New South Wales, I think from today essentially, or maybe even yesterday, organisations are really starting to shift into these hybrid working patterns, and some people are sort of heading back into the office for the first time in quite some time. So this is also quite relevant when we're talking about this in the scope of sort of online meetings and what that culture is going to look like. And while we really have been heavily relying on online meetings recently, of course, and over the last few years, it's very hard to sort of get work done necessarily in those meetings. And there's also that sort of fatigue and that burnout that's associated with having these back-to-back meetings all day, every day as well. We also know that people are sort of working, different hours now that we've sort of lived the last 2 years the way that we have, working from home most of the time. Some people may be working, later into the evening. Some people may opt to work earlier on in the day. People being able to sort of be quite flexible in the way that they operate. When it comes to the how, we want you to really think about sort of the real purpose behind the meeting that you're hosting. So we would definitely reserve, meetings and calls to be more so for this sort of trust building, for the more complex discussions, but then having more of those regular, status update, what I'm working on, what I'm going to work on type sessions, to maybe have that discussion within a channel or a chat context potentially. And for those big broader updates, again, similar to what we looked at for the email, to maybe look at a platform like Yammer for those sorts of discussions too. So the what good looks like, again, what we spoke about and what we looked at in the quiz, we found that for the higher performers, it's for every 35 minutes that you're spending in Teams meetings or calls that you're then sending the one channel or Yammer message. And then on the other end of the spectrum as well, we're seeing that for every 1,000 minutes spent in Teams meetings, then there's the one message being posted in channels or in Yammer. I think we do also have sort of some ROI working as well on this, Laurie.
Just you can show the rest of it if you like, Emily. So again, with our preliminary benchmarking group, 9 organisations, and in this case 45,000 that had actually spent some time in a meeting or a call. So there's nobody with dead accounts in here. The interesting thing about that is that it is a very, if you like, skewed distribution. So 10% of the staff are responsible for 53% of all minutes spent in calls and meetings. So it's quite high. On average, 8 meetings a week or 6 hours a week. Now, that doesn't sound a lot, but remember, we're talking about the actual time they are actually online, like now, and your audio minutes are being calculated right now. So it could feel like you're in back-to-back meetings in your calendar, but if you actually work out when you're actually online, it might be less than you think. But if we do the same sort of thing, and the thing we took up here, we said, well, what happens if that 10%, only that top 10%, of the average of 8 meetings a week, if they just converted one of those meetings to be asynchronous? What would be the value of that? And if we run through the calculations on that with 20,000 staff, again, we come up with a pretty big number, 176,000 a week, 8.5 million a year, so there were 50 more staff, simply by those people that meet the most, the busiest people, just converting one of their meetings to asynchronous channels. So,
I think we just found a way of justifying getting Kirsty in and helping people with running online meetings. Or not online meetings, sorry, working asynchronously.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. Yeah, getting to understand what that looks like. Do a lot of that, yes.
Yeah, so, the numbers stack up pretty quickly. So, the ROI is there. And as I said, I think any of those top 10% would be quite happy to go to one less meeting a week, I'm sure. So if they can be coached into how to do that, it has a multiplier effect, of course, because these people are often senior managers, and of course, everybody they invite in, they're taking their time as well. So it has this very multiplier effect when that top 10% are too active, if you like, in meetings.
Can I also say on the top of that as well, when you look at the productivity savings, when you start to add in things like planner or lists, and so you're not living in the past and you're working from the here and now moving forward, and then you add this in and the conversations that can be around even just those agenda items in a meeting, it makes them then, there's so many other content and context you could put into play that would actually support some of this.
Totally agree. I mean,
productivity.
These are like very conservative numbers, we believe, so we haven't even talked about the collaboration effect. This is purely time saving. It's got nothing to do with collaboration effect, which is huge as well. So,
but I think the big challenge is that we are, and it's hard for us not to be like aggressive in our use of technology, but we always have to remember that there's a bunch of people out there, and current status for them is, I'm doing all of this in email. My tasks are in my email, my meeting minutes, my project management, my everything is in email. And then taking them all the way up to the front, and say, you're going to lose marks of this for this, and you're going to do this for this and this for that. We just can't get them to move that fast. So that's why I think we at our we sort of had to go, all right, well, let's take people from where they are and let's just try and nudge them forward just a little bit, right? And even just that little bit is going to have a huge, substantial bottom line impact. And if that can just be and we're not being very ambitious, are we? Just send one email less per day and move that into a Teams channel on Yammer. That's all we're asking. You're looking at a substantial save. And then, then we can start working with them on other things after that. But I think we got to go. There's so much to be achieved by just doing the little bits up front.
Okay. Back to you, Emily.
I just will quickly also show, like similar to how we looked at this with the data for the email liberated, also how that looks like for that asynchronous collaborator score as well. So back to my own personal insights again, just to show you what this looks like for myself. So for me, the ratio is looking at about 29 minutes for every one Teams channel or Yammer message, which is meaning that I'm sort of sitting at top 20%. And also just to show you sort of the next iteration of what this looks like with sort of nudging and praises, so that you can potentially see how you're improving those measures, or maybe if you are sort of moving backwards. just to show you this dashboard here as well, to give me some extra insights around what I'm currently doing. So I can see here, for example, on the personal level, that I'm doing a great job at sort of combining the chat with the channels and then the Yammer conversation. I can see that I'm being praised for my overall collaboration score as well, and also being able to understand where I am having those positive movements. So for Email Liberated, what we've spoken about today, over the most recent 30 days, things have sort of improved. And I can also see some extra metrics there around my sort of meeting type habits around screen sharing, sort of unlocking an award there, and then also for the file sharer one as well. But I'm sure we'll have, we've got plenty of other sort of great content and resources for you to deep dive into some of those other habits and how you can focus on those as well. Just jumping back into the organisation that maybe needed a little bit of assistance as well for the asynchronous collaborator. For this particular example, people have been in team meetings for 298 minutes for every channel or Yammer message there. So definitely big opportunity for, you know, targeted learning or education campaigns to really help to focus in on these habits, to see where they're currently sitting and how they can maybe shift that dial as well. So I think in terms of what we'll sort of walk through today, we do, of course, you'll have access to those slides, and there's some great sort of takeaways and sort of nice summaries within that slide content as well to show you the good and the not so good and exactly what the habits are. But I just also wanted to leave you today, and before we even get into some extra questions or discussion, is that we do have a deadline coming up for our M365 benchmarking study. So if you can, if you just want to send me a message, if you're interested, or if you know anyone that might be interested in participating, this particular study is going to help show you how your organisation is using, getting the balance right across Teams, Yammer, Outlook, SharePoint and OneDrive, and also how you compare with other organisations. For you to participate, you'll have a free trial of SWOOP for M365, what I've shown you today. You'll have access to that for your own organisation. It's free, it's all 100% confidential. And also, if you're able to sort of jump on this offer relatively quickly, then you'll also receive a special custom benchmark report from Laurie, which gives you some really nice indicators about that sort of what good looks like, what bad looks like. And of course, you'll have the free trial to go alongside that as well. So there's the details there to access. There's a QR code you can use to sort of submit your details. Otherwise, please just reach out to me directly and I'll be happy to help you out there. But from there, I think if we want to jump into any extra questions or discussion, or Kirsty, if you have a few more things that you need to walk through, that sort of is where I'll leave things from SWOOP at the moment.
Oh, great, thank you. I think there's some certainly really interesting. It'd be great to see. Do you have a slide where it's just those final kind of figures? For 1 minute it's this, and for 1 minute it's that, and just to have them like consolidate on one slide? It'd be great to have, you know, from an adoption perspective, as an audience, where we could have a one slider. Yes, that's what we're looking for. So that, you know, when we're actually presenting this sort of thing in, and we're talking to senior leaders, or we're training, or where we're trying to convince people to change a habit, you know, it'd be great to have something like this that we can put into our own sort of slide decks and, you know, help and support, because it makes such a difference trying to get people over the line just to go one Teams message instead of an email, one chat instead of a meeting, and this is what you can do, because having those benefits, the benefit analysis of what we're trying to do is so important.
And
does anyone have any questions?
They're not big changes we have to make, right? They're achievable. No. They're not big, but it is a habit change, and that makes it hard.
It's a habit change.